The auction block stood like a gallows in Richmond's slave market. Solomon kept his eyes fixed on the muddy ground as the auctioneer's voice rang out through the humid summer air. Next up, a field hand, strong back, 24 years of age by estimate, answers to Solomon. Solomon felt dozens of eyes crawling over his skin. What they couldn't see was the mind behind his carefully blank expression, a mind that had learned to count cotton bales faster than any overseer, that could calculate yields and profits with uncanny accuracy, all while pretending he couldn't read a single word. "Bidding starts at $500, the auctioneer called. "Do I hear 500? The crowd remained silent. Solomon had been returned by his previous owner, a tobacco farmer who had complained that Solomon was slow-witted and untrainable. The truth was more complex. Solomon had carefully cultivated the appearance of dullness while performing precise mental calculations that kept him one step ahead of expectations, never exceeding them enough to draw attention, never falling short enough to invite the lash. $450, then. "Come now, gentlemen, look at that frame, good for at least 15 years of labor." More silence. Being passed over at auction was dangerous. It meant being sold to traders who moved slaves further south, where conditions were known to be more brutal. 400? A voice finally called from the back. 300? And not a penny more for damaged goods. Solomon recognized the voice of a notorious trader who supplied plantations in Mississippi and Louisiana. His stomach twisted. The Deep South meant sugar plantations, a virtual death sentence. "We have $300, the auctioneer said, disappointment evident in his tone. "Going once." $350. A woman's voice. This was unusual enough that Solomon risked a glance upward. Standing at the edge of the crowd was a woman in her 30s, dressed in the fine clothing of the plantation aristocracy. Beside her stood an older gentleman, her husband most likely, who looked surprised at her intervention. "Margaret, what are you doing?" the man hissed, loud enough for those nearby to hear. $350 from the lady, the auctioneer said, enthusiasm renewed. "Do I hear 375? $375, countered the trader. $400, the woman called Margaret replied firmly. $500, Margaret said after further bidding, her voice unwavering. Her husband grabbed her arm. "Margaret, stop this nonsense. He's been returned once already, clearly defective. $500 going once, going twice." "Sold to Mrs. Hargrove for $500. D." As Solomon was led off the auction block, he caught a glimpse of Mrs. Hargrove's face. There was something calculating in her expression, not cruelty, but assessment. Solomon lowered his gaze again, but his mind was working furiously. Who was this woman? And why had she paid full price for a slave that no one else wanted? The Hargrove plantation sat 10 miles outside Richmond, a modest estate by Virginia standards. Solomon rode in the back of the wagon, hands bound, as Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove continued the argument that had begun at the auction. $500, Margaret, for a slave that was returned. Have you lost your senses? Thomas, you said yourself we needed another hand for the harvest. Yes, but not one with a reputation for being slow-witted. We could have purchased 2 younger boys for that price. I have my reasons, Margaret said cryptically. When they arrived at the plantation, Solomon was taken directly to the overseer, a red-faced man named Wilkins who looked him up and down with obvious disdain. "Another mouth to feed," Wilkins muttered. "And they say you're simple, boy. That right?" Solomon kept his eyes down. "Yes, sir." "Well, simple or not, you'll work. The fields need tending, and we're behind on the harvest." As Solomon was led away, he heard Mrs. Hargrove call after Wilkins. "Mr. Wilkins, I'd like Solomon assigned to the storage barn tomorrow. We need to take inventory before the harvest comes in." Wilkins frowned. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but counting and organizing requires someone who can read the labels and do figures." "I'm aware," Mrs. Hargrove replied coolly. I'll supervise him myself. Solomon felt a chill run down his spine. Had she somehow seen through his carefully constructed facade? He would need to be extremely careful. That night in the slave quarters, Solomon met his cabin mates, an elderly man named Moses, two brothers in their 30s called Isaac and Jacob, and a young man named Elijah. "Heard you was bought by Mrs. herself," Moses said. "That don't happen often." Solomon nodded. "She outbid a trader." "You're lucky then," Moses finally said. "Hargroves ain't the worst masters. Work is hard, but Wilkins don't use the whip much unless you cross him." "What's she like?" Solomon asked carefully. "Mrs. runs the books," Jacob explained. "Master Thomas handles the planting, but she manages the money. Smart woman, reads a lot, teaches their daughters too, not just household things but proper schooling." "She ever take special interest in other slaves?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Only Sarah," Elijah said. "Mrs.'s personal maid. Taught her to read a little, though that's supposed to be secret." Solomon's heart beat faster. A mistress who taught a slave to read was taking an enormous risk. Such actions were illegal in Virginia, punishable by fines or worse. The storage barn smelled of tobacco, hemp, and the previous year's grain. Solomon stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching as Mrs. Hargrove arranged ledgers and inventory lists on a small desk. "Do you know why I brought you here, Solomon?" she asked without looking up. "No, ma'am. Your previous owner claimed you were slow-witted, unable to follow simple instructions. Is that true?" Solomon hesitated. This was the moment where his performance needed to be flawless. "I try my best, ma'am." Mrs. Hargrove looked up at him, her blue eyes sharp and assessing. "That's not what I asked." Solomon maintained his carefully blank expression. "I ain't good with letters, ma'am. Can't read. Makes it hard sometimes." Mrs. Hargrove rose from her seat and walked to a shelf holding various containers. She selected 3 barrels of different sizes and arranged them in a row. "Let's try something simple. Count these for me." 1, 2, 3, Solomon replied, pointing to each barrel in turn. Mrs. Hargrove's expression remained neutral. "And if I take away these 2? She removed 2 barrels. "How many remain?" "1, ma'am." Mrs. Hargrove nodded. "Now, Solomon, I'm going to turn my back. I want you to count to 20, but do so very quickly. Can you do that?" Solomon felt the trap closing around him. Simple counting was expected of most field hands. It was necessary for harvesting. But counting quickly might reveal a comfort with numbers that belied his supposed slow-wittedness. "I'll try, ma'am." Mrs. Hargrove turned her back. Solomon counted to 20, deliberately stumbling on 14 and 17. When he finished, Mrs. Hargrove turned back to face him. Her expression gave nothing away. She led him to a corner of the barn where sacks of cotton were stacked in neat piles. "Last season's final harvest, sorted by quality. Count the sacks in this pile for me." Solomon counted the visible sacks. 12, ma'am. "Are you certain? Count again." Solomon pretended to count more carefully. 12 sacks, ma'am." Mrs. Hargrove's lips curved into the slightest smile. "Interesting. There are actually 14 sacks here. 2 are hidden behind the pile." She walked to her desk and returned with a small slate and chalk. She wrote a simple addition problem. 14 plus 23, Mao. "What do you see here, Solomon?" "Marks, ma'am. I don't know my letters or figures." "These aren't letters, these are numbers. 14 plus 23. Do you know what that equals?" Solomon shook his head. "No, ma'am." Mrs. Hargrove studied him for a long moment, then abruptly erased the slate. "Very well. I have one more task for you." She walked to a large pile of cotton bales in the center of the barn. "These need to be counted and sorted by weight. The weights are marked on each bale. Since you cannot read the numbers, I'll have to show you how to identify them by sight." After she left, Solomon stared at the bales, uncertain of her true intentions. If he sorted them too efficiently, he would reveal his understanding of numbers. If he made no progress, he risked punishment for laziness. As the morning progressed, Solomon became so absorbed in his task that he didn't hear Mrs. Hargrove return. He was muttering to himself as he worked. 24 sorted, 36 remaining, about 2/3 left. 2/3? Solomon froze. Mrs. Hargrove stood in the doorway, watching him with an unreadable expression. I was just counting, ma'am, Solomon stammered, genuine fear making his voice shake. Mrs. Hargrove approached slowly. You said 2/3. That's a fraction. People who can't count don't use fractions, Solomon. The game was up. Solomon stood very still, his mind racing through possible explanations, escape plans, consequences. How long have you been pretending? Mrs. Hargrove asked quietly. Solomon remained silent, eyes downcast. Look at me, she commanded. Slowly, Solomon raised his eyes to meet hers, letting his mask fall away. What she would see now was not the dull-witted field hand, but a man of intelligence and calculation. I suspected as much, Mrs. Hargrove said. No one who was truly slow-witted would have learned to hide it so well. Your eyes are too aware, too observant. What happens now, ma'am? Solomon asked, his voice different now, clearer, more articulate. Now, she said, we have a conversation about how valuable you might be to this plantation and what you might gain in return for your true abilities. Solomon sat on a wooden stool in Mrs. Hargrove's private study. He had never been inside the main house before, and the transition from field hand to confidant had happened so quickly that he still felt unbalanced. Mrs. Hargrove sat across from him, separated by a desk covered with ledgers and account books. The curtains were drawn, the door locked. No one could know about this meeting. I need to understand the extent of your abilities, Mrs. Hargrove said without preamble. Can you read? Solomon weighed his response. The truth could be dangerous, but lies would be easily discovered now. Yes, ma'am. Not as well as educated folks, but enough. And mathematics? Numbers come easy to me, always have. How did you learn? My first master had a son about my age. I would listen outside the window during his lessons. Later, I found discarded newspapers in the trash, read them by candlelight. Do you understand why I purchased you, Solomon? Not entirely, ma'am. Mrs. Hargrove opened one of the ledgers and turned it toward him. The page was filled with columns of numbers, annotations, calculations of expenses and profits. This plantation is failing, she said bluntly. My husband refuses to see it, but the numbers don't lie. 3 more seasons like the last, and we'll lose everything. Solomon studied the ledger, quickly identifying the problem. The Hargrove plantation was profitable, but barely, and much of that profit was being siphoned away. Someone was embezzling funds. You need someone who can audit the books, Solomon said. Someone who can find where the money's going. Yes, Mrs. Hargrove confirmed, but I can't hire an accountant without my husband knowing, and I can't accuse anyone without proof. The implication was clear. She needed someone invisible, someone who could investigate without raising suspicions. A slave. You suspect someone specific? Solomon asked. Wilkins, Mrs. Hargrove replied. He manages the sales, arranges transportation, handles payouts. Thomas trusts him implicitly. What do you want me to do? I need you to examine these ledgers, find the discrepancies, track the missing money, but no one can know. Not my husband, not the house staff, certainly not Wilkins. And what do I gain from this arrangement? He asked carefully. A flicker of surprise crossed Mrs. Hargrove's face, quickly replaced by calculation. You speak very directly for a slave. You asked for my true abilities, ma'am. This is part of them. A moment of tension stretched between them, the inevitable friction of a power dynamic being recalibrated. Then Mrs. Hargrove smiled slightly. "Fair enough. What would you ask for?" Solomon had prepared for this question. "Safety for myself, better conditions for the others, and eventually my freedom." Mrs. Hargrove's eyebrows rose. "Freedom? That's asking a considerable amount." "You're asking a considerable amount of me," Solomon countered. "The risk is significant." "I can promise safety and improved conditions," she said finally. "Freedom would have to depend on results, and would require my husband's agreement." Solomon nodded. It was a conditional promise, but more than he had dared hope for initially. "When do we begin?" "Tonight," Mrs. Hargrove said. "I'll arrange for you to work in the house, cleaning my study. After the household retires, you can examine the ledgers. I'll need something to record my findings. Use this." Mrs. Hargrove handed him a small notebook. "Hide it on your person. If anyone finds it, claim you stole it, and I'll punish you accordingly." The clinical way she discussed his potential punishment sent a chill through Solomon, reminding him that despite this unusual arrangement, she was still his owner. His life was still in her hands. "One last thing," Mrs. Hargrove said. "You will continue to act simple-minded around everyone else. Your survival depends on it, as does mine." That night, after the household retired, Solomon was left alone in Mrs. Hargrove's study as planned. He carefully closed the door, lit a single candle, and began his real work. The ledgers told a story. The Hargrove plantation produced tobacco primarily, with some cotton and corn. Sales had been steady for years, but profits had been declining gradually. So gradually that someone not paying close attention might attribute it to natural market fluctuations. But Solomon saw the pattern, small amounts missing from each sale, transportation costs that seemed inflated, supply purchases that didn't match the plantation's needs. Individually, each discrepancy was tiny. Together, they represented a significant drain on the plantation's resources, and all of them involved transactions managed by Wilkins. Solomon made careful notes, developing a system of shorthand that would be meaningless to anyone else who might see it. As he worked, he became aware of a presence in the doorway behind him. He quickly blew out the candle and pocketed the notebook, his heart pounding. Had he been discovered so soon? "I know you're in there," a woman's voice whispered. "What are you doing?" It was Sarah, Mrs. Hargrove's maid. "Just finishing my cleaning, Mom." "In the dark?" Sarah entered the room carrying a small lamp that illuminated her skeptical expression. "You were reading something." "No, Mom. I can't read." Sarah set her lamp down on the desk, the light falling across the open ledger. "Then what is this doing out? Mrs. Hargrove always locks these away." Solomon realized he had made a critical error. In his absorption with the numbers, he had forgotten the fundamental rule of survival: never leave evidence. "Mrs. Hargrove must have left it out," he said, trying to maintain his facade. Sarah studied him. "You're not simple at all. Are you?" The question hung between them, dangerous in its directness. "Mrs. says you can read a little," he said finally, changing tactics. "That true?" Sarah stiffened. "Who told you that?" "The others said Mrs. taught you." "That's not for anyone to know or discuss," Sarah replied sharply. "Why are you asking?" Solomon took a calculated risk. "Maybe we both have secrets that could get us in trouble." Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes, followed by wariness. "What game are you playing? What has Mrs. Hargrove set you to do?" "I'm just trying to survive," Solomon replied honestly. "Same as you." Sarah considered this. "Does what you're doing help or harm the others, our people?" "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but if it works, there might be improvements. For everyone." Sarah nodded slowly. I'll keep your secret for now. But if I sense danger coming to the others because of whatever you're doing, I'll stop you myself." "Fair enough," Solomon agreed. 3 nights later, Solomon had compiled enough evidence to present to Mrs. Hargrove. The pattern was clear. Over the past 5 years, Wilkins had embezzled nearly $3 from the plantation, a substantial sum that represented the difference between modest prosperity and the plantation's current precarious financial state. The method was clever in its simplicity. Wilkins inflated transportation costs when shipping tobacco to market, pocketing the difference. He reported lower sale prices than were actually received. He ordered supplies that never arrived at the plantation. And most brazenly, he had created a fictional slave named Josiah, who had supposedly died of fever 2 years earlier, but whose labor was still being calculated into production costs, creating a channel for funds to disappear. Solomon presented his findings to Mrs. Hargrove in their 3rd late-night meeting. "The evidence is conclusive," he explained, showing her his careful notes. "Wilkins has been systematically draining the plantation's profits." Mrs. Hargrove examined his work, her expression darkening. "This is even worse than I suspected. The question now is how to proceed." "You could present the evidence to Mr. Hargrove," Solomon suggested. Mrs. Hargrove shook her head. "Thomas trusts Wilkins implicitly. They fought together in the Mexican War. He would demand to know how I discovered this, which would expose your abilities." "Then what do you propose?" "We need to catch Wilkins in the act. The tobacco harvest will be going to market next week. If we can prove that he's lying about the sale price, you would need someone you trust to follow him to Richmond," Solomon said. "Someone who could witness the actual transaction." "Yes," Mrs. Hargrove studied him, "someone intelligent, observant, and inconspicuous." Solomon understood immediately. "You want me to go to Richmond?" "A slave running an errand would draw no attention. You could follow Wilkins, observe the sale, then report back to me." The plan made logical sense, but the risk was enormous. Richmond was full of slave patrols, and Solomon would have no legitimate reason to be there without Wilkins knowing. "If I'm caught," he began. "You won't be," Mrs. Hargrove said. "I'll provide you with written permission to be in the city on my business. You'll need to stay out of Wilkins' sight, but you'll be legally protected if questioned." "I'll need money," he said. "Not much, but enough to appear to be on legitimate business, and city clothes, not field clothes. I'll arrange it. The shipment leaves Monday at dawn. One more thing," Mrs. Hargrove added. "You'll need someone who knows Richmond well. Sarah will accompany you. She knows the city and can help navigate safely." As Solomon slipped out of the study, he couldn't shake the feeling that the mission to Richmond represented a point of no return. Until now, his investigation had been conducted in relative safety. Venturing into the city to spy on Wilkins would expose him to risks he couldn't fully calculate. Monday morning arrived with a heavy fog shrouding the plantation, as if nature itself were providing cover for Solomon's mission. He stood in the pre-dawn darkness behind the kitchen building, dressed in the clothes Mrs. Hargrove had provided, a plain but well-made shirt, woolen trousers, and a jacket that marked him as a house servant on an errand rather than a field hand. Sarah joined him, similarly dressed for travel. Her face was a mask of barely contained anxiety. "Mrs. Hargrove explained everything?" Solomon asked quietly. Sarah nodded. "Enough. Wilkins has been stealing. We need to catch him. If we succeed, conditions improve for everyone." "And if we fail?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "We'll be sold south, or worse." At least she understood the stakes. Solomon handed her the small pouch of coins Mrs. Hargrove had provided. "You keep these. You know the city better than I do." Sarah took the pouch. We should leave separately. Wilkins left with the tobacco wagons half an hour ago. We'll meet at the crossroads 2 miles east. The plan was for Sarah to claim she was being sent to purchase supplies for the household, while Solomon carried a letter to one of Mr. Hargrove's business associates, legitimate excuses for them to be in Richmond that wouldn't raise suspicion if they were questioned. With that, she slipped away into the fog. Solomon counted off 10 minutes, then followed. The journey to Richmond would take 3 hours on foot. At the crossroads, Sarah was waiting as planned. Together they continued toward the city. "Tell me about Wilkins' routine in the city," Solomon said quietly as they walked. "He always follows the same pattern," Sarah replied. "First, he takes the tobacco to Tate's warehouse on Carey Street. After the sale, he deposits the plantation money at the farmer's bank, keeping whatever he skimmed for himself. Then he visits a tavern called the Crossed Keys before starting back." The tavern is where he'd be most vulnerable," Solomon observed. "His guard would be down." Sarah nodded. "You can watch the warehouse to verify the sale price, and I'll follow him to the bank to see how much he actually deposits." As they approached the city limits, the streets became more crowded. Richmond in 1851 was a city of contradictions. Elegant townhouses stood alongside industrial buildings, the air thick with smoke from the ironworks along the river. "We should separate here," Sarah said. "Tate's is 2 blocks south. The bank is on Main Street. We'll meet at Bell's Apothecary at midday." Solomon reached Tate's warehouse and positioned himself across the street, pretending to examine the goods in a shop window while watching the warehouse entrance. The Hargrove Plantation's wagons were already there, the distinctive H branded on each tobacco hogshead, visible even from a distance. After nearly an hour of waiting, Solomon spotted Wilkins emerging from the warehouse office, shaking hands with a man in a fine suit, presumably Mr. Tate or his agent. As Wilkins headed toward the bank, Solomon made a bold decision. Instead of following, he crossed the street and approached the warehouse office. This was dangerous. If anyone from the plantation saw him here, his cover would be blown. But he needed to confirm the sale price. Solomon removed his hat as he entered the office, adopting the deferential posture expected of a slave. A clerk looked up from his ledger. "Yes, what do you want?" "Message for Mr. Tate, sir," Solomon said, his voice pitched higher than normal. "From Mr. Johnson about the tobacco price." The clerk frowned. "Mr. Tate is busy." "What Johnson?" "From Charles City County, sir. Said to ask about today's price for prime leaf. He's bringing his crop tomorrow." The clerk seemed to accept this. "Tell Mr. Johnson the market's strong. We just paid $58 per hundredweight for the Hargrove Plantation's prime tobacco. Same grade should fetch the same tomorrow." $58. Solomon committed the number to memory. "Thank you kindly, sir. I'll tell him." As Solomon left the warehouse, his mind was racing. If Wilkins reported a lower price to Mrs. Hargrove, as Solomon suspected he would, they would have their proof. Solomon made his way to Bell's Apothecary. Twice he had to duck into alleyways to avoid slave patrols. His pass would likely satisfy them, but any interaction with authorities increased the risk of discovery. Bell's Apothecary was busy with midday customers when Solomon arrived. He waited outside, scanning the street for any sign of Sarah. Minutes stretched into a half hour with no sign of her. Solomon's anxiety grew. Had she been caught, recognized by Wilkins, detained by a patrol? Just as he was considering searching for her, Solomon spotted Sarah approaching from the direction of the bank. Her face was tense, and she was walking quickly, too quickly. Something was wrong. She grabbed his arm as she reached him, pulling him away from the apothecary. "We need to leave, now." "What happened?" "Wilkins saw me," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. "I was across from the bank watching. He came out and looked right at me. I don't think he realized what I was doing, but he definitely saw me. This changed everything. If Wilkins connected Sarah's presence in Richmond with his bank transaction, he might become suspicious. "Did you see how much he deposited?" Solomon asked as they hurried through the streets, heading toward the city limits. "Yes, $42 per hundredweight. He reported the sale at $16 less than the actual price. The discrepancy was even larger than Solomon had anticipated. On a shipment of this size, Wilkins was pocketing hundreds of dollars, money that should have gone to the plantation. "We have what we need," Solomon said. "Now we just need to get back safely and report to Mrs. Hargrove." But returning to the plantation presented a new problem. If they arrived too soon after Wilkins, he might realize they had followed him to the city. If they delayed too long, they risked being caught after dark without legitimate reason to be on the roads. "We should split up again," Sarah suggested. "Take different routes back. I'll go first and explain to Mrs. Hargrove what we found. You follow an hour later." With that, Sarah departed, leaving Solomon alone in a city that seemed suddenly more hostile. After an hour had passed, Solomon began his journey back to the plantation. It was late afternoon when Solomon spotted a familiar figure ahead on the road. Wilkins, riding slowly on horseback. The overseer was returning from his day in Richmond, and from the slight sway in his saddle, he had indulged heavily at the Crossed Keys Tavern. Solomon's first instinct was to hide, but that would mean being even later returning to the plantation. Instead, he steeled himself and continued walking, head down, hoping Wilkins was too intoxicated to recognize him in his city clothes. As Wilkins approached, he reined in his horse, peering down at Solomon with bleary suspicion. "You? Solomon, ain't it? What the hell are you doing on this road?" Solomon kept his eyes lowered, presenting his pass. "Errand for Mistress, sir, delivering a letter in Richmond." Wilkins snatched the pass, studying it with narrowed eyes. "Mrs. Hargrove sent you to Richmond? Since when does she trust a field hand with city errands?" "Don't know, sir. Just following orders." Wilkins handed the pass back, his suspicion evident. "Curious timing. First her maid shows up in town, now you. What's going on?" "Nothing I know about, sir." Wilkins studied him for a long moment, then spat in the dust. "Get back to the plantation and tell Mrs. Hargrove I want a word about using field hands for house errands during harvest season." With that, he spurred his horse and continued on, leaving Solomon standing in the road, heart pounding. Wilkins was connecting the dots, Sarah in Richmond, then Solomon. The overseer wasn't stupid. He would realize something was amiss. The sun was setting by the time the plantation came into view. Solomon hurried toward the main house, but as he approached, he saw a commotion near the overseer's cabin. Several slaves were gathered, watching something. Among them was Moses, whose grave expression sent a chill through Solomon. "What's happening?" Solomon asked as he joined the group. Moses turned to him, eyes wide with alarm. Wilkins came back in a rage, went straight to the master, making accusations. Now they're questioning Sarah. Solomon's blood ran cold. Accusations about what? Says she was spying on him in Richmond, following him. Says it must have been on Mrs. Hargrove's orders, since Sarah never leaves the plantation without permission. The situation was worse than Solomon had feared. Wilkins had realized the truth, or enough of it to be dangerous. "Where's Mrs. Hargrove?" Solomon asked urgently. "In the house. Master Thomas ordered her to stay there while he deals with this." Solomon had to make a decision. If he went to the overseer's cabin, he would implicate himself further. If he went to Mrs. Hargrove, he might be able to formulate a plan to protect Sarah and himself. Breaking away, Solomon circled behind the outbuildings, making his way to the rear entrance of the main house. As he slipped inside, he could hear raised voices from the front parlor, Mr. Hargrove and Mrs. Hargrove in heated argument. "Absolutely unacceptable, Margaret. Sending slaves to spy on my overseer? What were you thinking?" I was thinking about the future of this plantation, Thomas. Wilkins is stealing from us. I have proof. Proof? What proof could you possibly have? Solomon hesitated in the hallway. This was the moment of truth. Mrs. Hargrove could reveal his role now, could explain how he had uncovered Wilkins's embezzlement, or she could protect him and lose her own credibility in the process. "I've been reviewing the ledgers," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice steadier now. "The numbers don't add up. Sales reported at lower prices than market value. Supplies paid for but never delivered. And today I sent Sarah to verify my suspicions. By following Wilkins like a common spy, this is madness, Margaret. Is it madness to protect what's ours? The plantation is failing, Thomas, and Wilkins is the reason why." There was a long silence. Then Mr. Hargrove spoke again. "Even if what you say is true, and I'm not saying it is, your methods are inexcusable. Using slaves to undermine my authority, to spy on a white man." "Check the ledgers yourself," Mrs. Hargrove replied. "Ask Wilkins directly what price he received for today's tobacco. Compare it to what he reports to you. The truth will be clear enough." Another silence. Longer this time. Solomon waited, scarcely breathing. "I'll look into it," Mr. Hargrove said finally. "But this ends now, Margaret. No more sending slaves on secret missions." "And Sarah?" Mrs. Hargrove asked. "Wilkins was threatening to whip her." "I've ordered her confined to the kitchen house for now. No punishment until I've established the facts." The conversation was moving to other matters. Solomon withdrew quietly, processing what he had heard. Mrs. Hargrove had protected him, taking full responsibility for the investigation into Wilkins. Sarah was safe for the moment, though confined, and Mr. Hargrove, while skeptical, had agreed to examine the evidence. Solomon made his way to the kitchen house, where he found Sarah sitting alone, her face tear-streaked but composed. "You made it back," she whispered. "I feared Wilkins might have caught you on the road." "He did," Solomon replied quietly, "but he let me pass. He was more concerned about seeing you in Richmond." Sarah nodded. "He was furious, dragged me straight to Master Thomas, accusing me of spying. Mrs. Hargrove is talking to Mr. Hargrove now. She's convinced him to check the ledgers and verify the tobacco price himself. And us? What happens to us?" "We wait," Solomon said, "and we prepare for whatever comes." The plantation was unnaturally quiet the next morning. The field hands went about their work under the supervision of Isaac, temporarily appointed to oversee the day's labor. Wilkins was nowhere to be seen, confined to his cabin by Mr. Hargrove's order while the investigation continued. Solomon had been summoned to the main house at dawn. He now stood in Mrs. Hargrove's study, where Mr. Hargrove sat behind the desk, ledgers spread open before him. Mrs. Hargrove stood by the window, her posture rigid with tension. "You're certain of these figures?" Mr. Hargrove asked, looking up at Solomon. "Yes, sir. The tobacco sold for $58 per hundredweight. I heard it directly from the clerk at Tate's warehouse." Mr. Hargrove rubbed his forehead. "And Wilkins reported $42. A difference of $16 per hundredweight. On yesterday's shipment alone, that's over $300 missing." Mrs. Hargrove turned from the window. "And as I've shown you, Thomas, this has been happening for years. Small amounts, consistently skimmed, adding up to thousands." Mr. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He was a proud man, and admitting he had been deceived by someone he trusted was clearly difficult. "What I still don't understand," Mr. Hargrove said, looking directly at Solomon, "is your role in all this. My wife tells me you discovered the discrepancies in the ledgers, that you can read and calculate with remarkable skill, yet you were sold to us as slow-witted and illiterate." This was the moment Solomon had been both anticipating and dreading. "I learned to hide my abilities, sir," Solomon said carefully. Previous owners punished slaves who showed too much intelligence. It was safer to appear simple. And my wife discovered your deception. Yes, sir. Mrs. Hargrove saw that I could count and calculate. She recognized my potential value. Mr. Hargrove's expression remained stern, but something like reluctant respect flickered in his eyes. It appears I've been deceived by both my overseer and my property, an uncomfortable position for any man. Thomas, Mrs. Hargrove interjected, Solomon has done this plantation a great service. Without his skills, we might never have discovered Wilkins' theft. Mr. Hargrove rose from the desk, pacing the small room. That may be true, Margaret, but it doesn't change the fundamental impropriety of what you've done. Allowing a slave to examine our financial records. Sending him to Richmond to spy on a white man. These actions violate every social convention that maintains order on a plantation. Conventions that allow us to be robbed blind, Mrs. Hargrove countered. Conventions that would have seen us bankrupt within 5 years. What would you have me do, Margaret? Mr. Hargrove asked finally. Dismiss Wilkins, certainly. But what about him? He gestured toward Solomon. A slave who can read, write, and calculate is dangerous. Mrs. Hargrove moved to stand beside Solomon. I made Solomon a promise, Thomas. In exchange for his help, I offered him protection and improved conditions for the others. Mr. Hargrove's eyebrows rose. Improved conditions? What, specifically? Better food, reduced work hours on Sundays, medical care when needed. Mr. Hargrove seemed to consider this. And what else did you promise him, Margaret? Mrs. Hargrove hesitated. Eventually, his freedom. The word hung in the air. Mr. Hargrove's face darkened. Freedom? You had no right to make such a promise. Perhaps not legally, Mrs. Hargrove conceded, but morally, this man has saved our plantation, our daughter's inheritance. Without him, we would have continued our decline into insolvency. Mr. Hargrove turned away, staring out the window at the fields beyond. Solomon could almost see the conflict within him, between financial pragmatism and social convention, between gratitude and fear. Sir, Solomon said quietly. If I may? Mr. Hargrove glanced back, surprised at the interruption. Yes? I understand your concerns. A promise of freedom is significant. Perhaps we could establish conditions, a period of continued service during which I help restructure the plantation's finances, train someone else to maintain the ledgers properly, ensure the transition to a new overseer goes smoothly. My freedom earned through additional service that benefits the plantation. It was a compromise, one that acknowledged Mr. Hargrove's authority while offering a path forward that all could accept. Mr. Hargrove studied Solomon with new interest. You speak very well for someone who pretended to be simple-minded. Yes, sir, part of the pretense. And what would prevent you from running once you've been given more privileges? Because I could have run many times already, but chose not to, Solomon replied honestly. Because I believe an agreement honored by both parties offers more security than an escape with no resources and no protection. Mr. Hargrove returned to the desk, his decision apparently made. Here is what I propose. Wilkins will be dismissed immediately. You, Solomon, will assume responsibility for maintaining the plantation's financial records under my wife's supervision. The other slaves will receive the improvements you requested. He paused, then continued reluctantly. As for freedom, I will consider a manumission agreement with specific conditions to be met over a period of 5 years. If those conditions are satisfied, and if your conduct remains exemplary, I will sign your free papers myself. It wasn't immediate freedom, but it was a formal commitment, more than Solomon had dared hope for. Thank you, sir, Solomon said, keeping his voice steady despite the surge of emotion. "Don't thank me yet," Mr. Hargrove warned. "There will be difficulties ahead. The other slaves will question your new position. Neighboring planters will disapprove of the arrangement. And Wilkins will not accept his dismissal quietly." "I understand, sir." "Good." Mr. Hargrove gathered the ledgers. "We'll speak with Wilkins now. Margaret, have Jeremiah fetch him to my study." As Mrs. Hargrove left to give the instruction, Mr. Hargrove turned back to Solomon. "One last thing. This arrangement between us remains private. To the outside world you are still a slave, albeit one with unusual privileges. Any hint that you have been promised freedom could create complications." Solomon nodded. Freedom that existed only as a private promise was precarious, but it was still a path forward. The confrontation with Wilkins took place in Mr. Hargrove's formal study. Wilkins entered warily, his eyes widening in surprise and anger when he saw Solomon standing quietly in the corner. "What is the meaning of this, Mr. Hargrove?" Wilkins demanded. "Why is he here?" "He's here because he's part of this discussion," Mr. Hargrove replied coolly. "Please sit down." Wilkins remained standing, his posture defensive. "If this is about yesterday, I can explain." "This is about theft, Mr. Wilkins," Mr. Hargrove interrupted, his voice hard. "Systematic, calculated theft from this plantation over a period of years." He pushed the ledgers across the desk. "Yesterday's tobacco shipment sold for $58 per hundredweight. You reported 42. The difference amounts to over $300 on that shipment alone. And this," he tapped another ledger, "shows a pattern of similar discrepancies dating back at least 5 years. Wilkins paled, then flushed with anger. "This is absurd. You're taking the word of slaves over mine? I've served you faithfully for 8 years. "I've verified the sale price independently," Mr. Hargrove said, "and the ledgers speak for themselves. There's also the matter of the fictional slave Josiah, whose labor costs have been charged to the plantation for 2 years after his supposed death." Wilkins' eyes darted to Solomon, hatred plain in his expression. "This is his doing. He's poisoned your mind against me." "You have a choice," Mr. Hargrove continued. "You can leave quietly, today, with a letter stating you resigned for personal reasons, or I can present evidence of your theft to the authorities and to every plantation owner in the county. Your reputation would never recover." Wilkins seemed to deflate, the fight going out of him, as he realized the extent of the evidence against him. "I'll go," he said finally, "but this isn't the end of the matter." His gaze fixed on Solomon again, the threat implicit. Solomon met his eyes steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "You have until sunset to collect your belongings and leave the property," Mr. Hargrove said. Wilkins turned without another word and left the study, his footsteps heavy in the hallway beyond. "He'll cause trouble," Mrs. Hargrove said when he was gone. "Let him try, Mr. Hargrove replied. "The word of a dismissed overseer caught stealing will carry little weight, and we have more pressing matters to address, namely how to explain Solomon's new position to the rest of the plantation." "We tell a version of the truth," Solomon suggested, "that I demonstrated an aptitude for numbers while working in the storage barn, that Mrs. Hargrove recognized my potential usefulness in managing inventory. The transition from there to broader responsibilities can happen gradually without raising undue suspicion." Mr. Hargrove nodded approvingly. "A sensible approach. We'll begin implementing the changes today." As Solomon left the study, he felt a strange mixture of emotions: triumph at Wilkins' downfall, hope for the future he might build, anxiety about the dangers that still lay ahead. The path to freedom had opened before him, but it remained narrow and fraught with pitfalls. In the hallway, Sarah was waiting, her expression questioning. Solomon nodded slightly, indicating success. Her relief was visible, though she maintained her composed demeanor, as a house slave should. "Mrs. Hargrove asks that you prepare the small office adjoining the library," Sarah said loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. "She wishes to use it for inventory management." "Yes, ma'am," Solomon replied in the deferential tone expected of him. But as they walked together down the hallway, out of earshot of the Hargroves, Sarah whispered, "Is it true? Did Mr. Hargrove promise your freedom?" "It did conditionally, after 5 years of service managing the plantation's finances." Sarah's eyes widened. "And the improvements for everyone else?" "Granted immediately. Better food, reduced Sunday work, medical care when needed." Sarah stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "You've accomplished something extraordinary, Solomon. Something I never thought possible." It's just the beginning," Solomon replied. 5 years is a long time, and Wilkins is still a threat." "But it's hope," Sarah insisted. "Real hope, not just for you, but for all of us. If one can gain freedom through service, perhaps others can too." Solomon hadn't considered this broader implication, that his arrangement with the Hargroves might create a precedent. The thought was both exhilarating and sobering. He would be watched closely, his success or failure potentially affecting others beyond himself. As they continued down the hallway, Solomon reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. From the auction block where no one wanted him, to a position of unprecedented responsibility and the promise of freedom. He had survived by hiding his intelligence, then thrived by revealing it. The future remained uncertain. Wilkins was a threat. The 5-year manumission agreement could be broken. But for the first time since being taken from his home as a child, Solomon had something precious and previously unimaginable, control over his own destiny. Outside, the plantation continued its rhythms. Slaves working in the fields, smoke rising from the kitchen house, wagons moving along the dusty roads. To a casual observer, nothing had changed. But beneath this appearance of continuity, a transformation had begun. A single act of recognition, Mrs. Hargrove seeing Solomon's true abilities, had set in motion changes that would ripple outward, affecting lives in ways no one could fully predict. Solomon stepped out onto the porch, looking toward the slave quarters where he had lived upon arrival. He would be moved to different accommodation now, a small room attached to the storage barn that would reflect his intermediate status, neither fully slave nor free. It was a precarious position, balanced between worlds. But it was also a position of power and possibility. With knowledge, with calculation, with patient determination, he would convert this opportunity into the freedom he had always desired, not just for himself, but perhaps, eventually, for others. The illiterate slave no one wanted had been a carefully constructed fiction. The man beneath that disguise, the man who could count faster than any overseer, who could detect theft through careful analysis of numbers, who could negotiate his own path to freedom, that man was the truth. And truth, Solomon believed, would always find its way to the surface, no matter how deep it was buried. As he turned to begin his new duties, Solomon allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The journey was far from over, but a significant battle had been won. Now the real work could begin.